Throughout its history, Russia has invaded and occupied foreign lands, colonizing indigenous nations, destroying their national identity, and then using the same very nations to seize new territories and enslave other nations. As we see today in the 21st century, the methods that Kremlin used 400 years ago just do not change. And it does not matter how the state is called, the ancient Muscovia, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, or the nowadays Russian Federation, the essence remains the same. Today, just like other enslaved nations of the past, the Buryats give their lives away for the Kremlin's imperial ambitions, seemingly completely forgetting how several centuries ago the Muscovites killed their ancestors in the very same way to overtake the territories. And after the invaders' accession, the survivors were forced to forget the atrocities. Oppressive Kremlin has rewritten their national history and destroyed their cultural heritage.
The situation is terrible. Buryatia has found it on its own folk indeed. We literally help people to escape from their own land all night long.
I saw the statistics yesterday. On one soldier from the Moscow region that is killed comes 625 soldiers from Buryatia. I think it's genocide.
Let's disrupt the mobilization, stop the war.
Buryatia must become independent. The Buryat folk must choose their own way.
The history of Buryatia's entry into Russia was far from being peaceful.
I stand for Buryatia that lasts from Yenisei to Amur rivers. That is, as it were, exactly the territory that was subjected to Russian colonization at the time.
There was no voluntary affiliation.
You will have to fight for independence and sovereignty.
The gene pool must be protected.
After the announcement by the President of the Russian Federation of mobilization throughout the country, including the Republic of Buryatia, people began to be massively taken for the military registration to enlistment offices in order to be sent to war with Ukraine. They were taken from everywhere, from their homes, from educational institutions, just off the streets.
The mobilization is monstrous. In Buryatia, we felt it in full scale. People were dragged out of their beds, doors were kicked out. This is a targeted campaign to make men out of society, out of their homes, and send them to war. That is, there is no such thing as you voluntarily may come. People has literally been pulled out of everywhere. Police immediately stopped them into cars and they were taken to concentration points.
Куда едут они?
Сейчас на выбор.
Сейчас на выбор. А на сколько?
Я не знаю.
Сейчас называю фамилию. Вы проходите в автобус. Из автобуса никто не выходит. Время на берегу вам будет предоставлено на выезде из села Крумка.
Those who have not yet received the summons are now leaving the country en masse.
From the beginning of the mobilization, our foundation and I, as a journalist, as a public figure, simply didn't close our eyes. All night we helped people run away from Buryatia, because Buryatia has its borders with Mongolia. And since yesterday, the checkpoint was packed with miles-long queues, traffic jams. We have warned everyone before that the mobilization will happen. Unfortunately, that is, for the last 7 months, as long as the war has been going on, we told people that this all will definitely end up this way. And if you have the opportunity, well, then just leave the country.
The former president of Mongolia also did not remain indifferent and turned to the Buryat people.
One thing really disappointed me from the very beginning of the war. It is that the most people who suffered in Putin's war were representatives of national minorities. I saw the statistics yesterday. On one soldier from the Moscow region that is killed comes 625 soldiers from Buryatia. I think it's genocide, and I think they just went and gave them some money. These lives are precious. Someone's father dies, someone's son, someone's husband. For Putin, sending them on the war against Ukraine. These are just figures. But now I am calling on them. If you can escape, you can come to Mongolia. We will welcome you with an open heart and arms. If you are forcibly mobilized to Ukraine, there is another way. Surrender. Just tell them I don't want to shoot at you, and surrender.
In general, Putin really fights this war with the hands of the provinces, because the provinces have low wages, low standards of living. Therefore, you can seduce people to join this army, the war, and the money they pay maybe can really seduce someone. In general, why these tactics? Because if big Russian cities begin to participate in the war, if they start to take people at war from there, then you see even now, with this mobilization, it is, as it were, partial mobilization. They don't dare touch Moscow, they don't dare touch St. Petersburg, other big cities, because they have that understanding that as soon as there are some unrest in big cities, then this in general is a risk that Putin's regime will fall and there will be a coup.
То, что происходит в Бурятии, я считаю, что это не иначе, как геноцид бурятского народа, за который ответственен Владимир Putin.
And the attitude to the whole thing has changed dramatically. It's just heaven and earth. What happened before? What is now? There really a wholly misheard both in the messenger in the social networks, just women who yesterday approved it all. They are crying now. They don't know what to do and they say, "Oh, this awful war has really begun." And we answer them, well, excuse us, were there no war for 7 months? Maybe you thought it was something else apparently going on. However, despite all the horror of what is happening here, our anti-war movement has hope that in the way, by taking such a step, Putin hastened his fall, and so the people are at least a little startled by now. Maybe there will finally be some kind of a potential for this protest.
Despite the confusion of society in the Russian Federation, there are still brave people in Buryatia who are trying to resist the current regime, risking fines and imprisonment.
Мы против войны в Украине. Мы хотим, чтобы наши отцы, мужья и братья остались живы.
Сорвем мобилизацию, остановим войну. Обращаюсь к матерям, обращаюсь к женам, обращаюсь к сестрам, к женщинам. Только теперь мир смотрит на нас. Парней нужно защитить, генофонд нужно защитить.
Вам необходимо проследовать с нами.
Вы предупреждали о нас. Они... Стойте.
Вы отказываетесь? Прекратите.
In fact, it turns out that Russia acts as an empire that fights with the forces and resources of these colonies, which are not a pity to lose and which doesn't pose any threat to the existence of the empire itself. And the uprising on its outskirts is easy to suppress. This will have no effect at the general state of the mood in Russia.
Indeed, why should the Russians fight? There are other nations. To use colonized peoples to seize foreign territories, this is something very close to chauvinism.
In general, the very construction of Imperial Russia and the existence of the titular nation of Russians in it and the existence of ethnic minorities, its symbols, chauvinism, racism, and so on. This is in general the situation, well, roughly speaking, normal in general for any structures such as our statehood. Another thing is that other countries somehow opposed this at one time, somehow tried to talk about it all the same, highlight what is racism, and it is necessary to fight it and to respect the rights of minorities and so on. In Russia, it all has been replaced, and is being replaced now by a simple Soviet blurred construct of the friendship of peoples.
Россия для русских! Москва для москвичей! Будь сильным! Будь русским! Мир у себя дома! Мир у себя дома! Мир у себя дома! Отошел всех, постреляй! Отошли!
If you start talking about racism in Russia, about the situation of national minorities, then you are already swinging the boat and you are against the friendship of peoples. And there you go, in a blink of an eye, you are an agent of influence of some kind of CIA or something else, and the traitor and the enemy of state. Because the war is waging on. The enormous sentences, more than 20 years, are given and so on. That is why the fact that this is not spoken out, that it is just somehow is not on the public agenda in Russia, it continues to exist and thrive.
More than 190 nations live on the territory of the Russian Federation. Most of these people are indigenous nations who were enslaved and colonized at different periods of history. And how did Buryats end up in Russia after all?
In the 17th century, the expansion of the Muscovite state to Siberia began. This is, for example, a story written by the German historian Miller back in the 18th century.
Moscow's special operation to seize territories and enslave the Buryat tribes was carried out according to one scenario. Initially, the supporting fortresses of the prison were built, then materials and human resources were concentrated in them. Raids and campaigns against the surrounding tribes and people has been set up from the prison.
And this is one of the first questions that arises when reading books that allegedly all tribes, all peoples entered Russia voluntarily. Why did they build those fortresses then?
In 1626, a unit of Muscovite colonizers led by Maxim Perfiliev went on a war campaign. This campaign ended in failure, but the unit returned with eyes burning with greed and stories about the enormous wealth of Buryatia's land.
It was roughly the territory of the Krasnoyarsk's territory of the Yenisei River. How was it all happening in the beginning? The ex-soldiers were working first. In fact, they were, one might say, the units of scourts and soldiers of fortune, robbers. They come to a place where some tribe lives. They met with these people, give them some kind of symbolic gifts, and they say, "Here we come from far away, here we bring you these gifts from our king." And these tribes that met them, they were hospitable people, because that is the law. They gave something in return to these people, and after that they said, yes, these tribes, they brought us something, wool for example, and that means it is the oath to our sovereign.
The next year, Perfiliev and his colleagues again set off for the Buryat lands, but were defeated by a coalition of Buryat and Evenk princes, Irkinei, Mukhate and Balkay. The survived remnants of the detachment of the colonialists returned to the Yenisei prison in order to repeat the conquest campaign in 1629. This time, the campaign is personally led by the Yenisei regent governor, the Russian Tsar's courtier Yakov Khripunov, who is accompanied by Perfiliev. The purpose of the expansion is Yasak and the silver mines of the Buryat prince Okun. Khripunov's detachment sets out from the Yenisei prison. Another detachment sets out of the Krasnoyarsk fortress. Moving along the Ankara River, the colonizers reached the Okas River mouth. The campaign was not a pleasant walk in the park for the conquerors. There were several battles with the Buryats.
Naturally, the Buryats did not like these prisons were on their land. The forts were periodically burned down and the fortresses were raided.
In 1634, Prince Kogonia destroys the Vasily Dunaev's detachment, who came to the Bratsk prison for Yasak. Instead of it, Dunaev has found only his own death. The prison was given over to fire and destruction, and the following year, a punitive detachment of Centurion Nikolai Rudakovsky came to the ashes of the Bratsk prison. The detachment made a number of attacks on the Buryat camps, robbed them, collected the Yasak, seized hostages, and then has built a new Bratsk prison located further along the Oka shores.
There were bloody battles when warriors died, and also the civilian population, women and children, were taken as hostages and kept in chains in their fortress.
In 1639, a new punitive expedition followed with the pogroms, robberies, hostage-taking. As a result of this expansion, the Punishers managed to collect Yasak consisting of sable fur.
Here, during the war, which lasted throughout the 17th century, there were battles, there were victims of this war, and there were heroes. One of these heroes was mentioned in Russian sources. He was called Chepchigui.
The confrontation between the colonizers and the indigenous population was ever growing. To continue the special operation for the so-called voluntary entry of the Buryats into the Moscow kingdom, Vasily Vlasov headed a large military detachment, went from the Yakut prison in the winter of 1641 to the upper reaches of the Lena River. The first blow was inflicted on the Ulus of the Prince of Tukins of Echerits, Prince Chepchugui. The Buryats did not bow their heads before the invaders. The battle lasted all day. All the Buryat defenders of this Ulus died along with their prince, who rejected all enemy orders to surrender and was burned alive. The Muscovites captured all the women and children, and since there was no point in making them hostages, they all were murdered. The Muscovites continued to move south and east from Lake Baikal, capturing more and more Buryat lands.
The history of Buryatia century was far from peaceful. So, when an order from the central government of Moscow was received, that history just needs to be turned around on 118 degrees and rewritten in a completely different point of view. it was done. That's when the historians, of course, had to work hard, because it's very difficult, as Russian saying has it, to stretch a knoll over a globe when all the history has been documented. Anyhow, all the places in historical volumes, they say that in fact a very fierce battle took place were amended. And all of a sudden it appeared that in fact not only Buryats, all the nations entered the bosom of the Russian state with joy. But of course there was no voluntary affiliation.
That is the story that Kremlin has been telling all these years and taught in Russian schools had solely one goal: the destruction of the national identity of any other nations.
The first attempt to kill the self-consciousness of the Buryats was a forced baptism. The Buryats resisted. Many were baptized by force. They drove people from some ulus to an ice hole and simply dipped them tied up once into the river. As for other attempts to deprive our folk of self-consciousness, then of course I must now mention the purposeful policy of destroying the Buryat language. Unfortunately, the Soviet era passed as an asphalt roller over the Buryat language and over the languages of many other nations, and the Buddhist religion is the only one that has undergone complete destruction of the territory of the Soviet Union.
Buddhism is one of the European religions, has entered into all areas of life of a great part of the Buryat people. After the October Revolution, the anti-religious policy of the Soviet government led to that by the end of the 30s, all dead sons in the territory of Buryatia ceased to be. Their priests were subjected to repression, the property was looted, the dead sons themselves were destroyed.
All the lamas, respectively, are arrested and sent to the prison camps.
The clergy are accused of espionage, various sabotage and decomposed wrecking anti-state activity, taking any of the defense as insolvent. Ultimately, the anti-religious campaign led to the Buddhist denomination in Buryatia ceased to exist.
There is such evidence that, in my opinion, it was Solzhenitsyn. Somewhere it was written that in some prison settlement some real circles of hell were created, and in the innermost circle the Buryat lamas were thrown and they were not fed. And all around them very soon the bark from the trees had been eaten away.
The full-scale invasion of the Russian Federation on sovereign Ukraine on February 24, 2022 has shattered the whole world. Many countries have then begun to rethink their own security policy, joining the military unions, reviewing the defense budgets. Some processes has also been initiated in the Russian Federation itself. Many opposing politicians and public figures and activists and representatives of different nations began to support and defend the security and future of their own folk. The indigenous nations of the Russian Federation now pay attention to their freedom and sovereignty, and as a platform for such a processes has the movement of the League of the Nations become.
The League appeared this spring, or rather even at the end of this spring in May. This is the Union of National Democratic Nations, colonized by Russia. The League unites such movements as the Buryat National Democratic Movement, Bashkir, Erasure Nation, the Tatars, the Cossacks. I mean the Cossacks as a nation. You know, in Russia there are such people, Cossacks, who are mistakenly considered Russians, but they define themselves as Cossacks, and other peoples. It may seem that there are not so many proponents of the idea of independence, but if you take any Buryat, talk to him for a while about important things in life and the soul. In the end you will find out that he believes that Buryatia should be independent and the Buryat people should go their own way. We have crystallized such an idea. All of the nations represented in the League are fighting for their independence, for the division and the split from the Russian Empire, because after all, in the end, the Russian Federation is de facto the Russian Empire. Finally, these nations in the League gathered in some kind of a single organization with a single agenda to fight for independence.
Just as the League of Free Nations, the representatives of various indigenous nations that are part of the Russian Federation almost simultaneously organize a Forum of Free Nations of Russia.
The forum in Prague pursued the goal of signing the Declaration on the Decolonization of Russia. Actually, it was signed, including the signatories. I, as a representative of the Buryat nation. There were also representatives of Tatarstan, Ishkeria, Free Ingria and Karelia.
This is a truly historic event. Since the collapse of the USSR, for the first time, people have been openly talking about the fate of their people that are currently part of the Russian Federation.
I stand for Buryatia that lasts from Yenisei River to Amur River. That is, it is as it were, exactly the territory that was subjected to Russian colonization at one time. The first skirmishes with the Russians took place, in fact, from the formation of the Krasnoyarsk prison. But from a formal point of view, the existing Republic of Buryatia, which is independent, remained sovereign under the Constitution of 1992, despite some changes made by Putin. That is, if people adhere to the Constitution that was adopted in 1992, we are a sovereign and independent republic, although the word sovereign has been removed. It will be necessary to fight for independence and sovereignty, because it happened more than once in history that the Russians can unexpectedly return the so-called independence. But at the same time, Buryatia will still be a satellite state of the Russian world. And what we are fighting for is for the Russian world to fall apart and for us to have our own decision-making center, as it is now fancy to say Buryatsky. For me, it is more important that the Buryat nation be independent, and this can be done in different ways. This can be done very alone and evolutionary. In general, I am a supporter of such a theory that the Buryats would gain their independence, their sovereignty, through the diaspora, through emigration. Well, it is clear that this is an economic issue. That is, when the Buryat diaspora will earn or have a capital equal, well, at least equal to the budget of this Russian occupation administration that exists in Buryatia, then in general we can say that economically and even more so politically we will be independent and sovereign.
The sanctions that the civilized world has imposed on the Russian Federation will most likely be in effect for a long period of time, perhaps 10 years. In case so it happens that the Buryatia gains independence, then economic sanctions will not apply to it, since it will be a different state then.
I believe that sanctions and independence are a concept that is possible to be implemented only under certain conditions, and certainly not when Buryatia has gained its independence, and we are still surrounded by all sorts of remnants of the Russian world, a sort of a Far Eastern or Siberian republics. On contrary of some other representatives of our nations, I proceed from the notion that this is a collective responsibility for all of us, regardless of whether there were Buryats in Bucha or not. We are all responsible for the crimes committed there by the Russian army. This is unconditional, and we, the Buryats, the independent Buryatia nation, of course will be negotiating with Ukraine on the payment of reparations, on the extradition of the war criminals, of course. The Buryats had never had any active forms of resistance. They will emigrate, they will shrink, they will work slipshod, and so on. That is, no one here has unconditionally any motivation to become cannon fodder. On the other hand, as a representative of the Buryat nation, I still think about sovereignty and independence. I understand perfectly well that the Buryats might need some combat experience, and some may join the Russian army in order to learn how to shoot, and that's it. But in case that these mobilized Buryats get to Ukraine, I recommend them to simply lay down their arms and surrender.
Burunda bagaya hatang darulja turhun khliye soyulo aldыжы bayna.
Арбан долон зуны туршыды ургылжы дайн дажыр хулгай дерем хыгыр байгат Бурят монгол хыранием зылжы багын юм.
Арыс шалмыз күріне барлык дарымжыл байдлың гинжик битныр багая hatang гансын ыгдыжы тахылха чадыл тепте.